Let everybody find a seat here. Hate to default to the weather, but I am loving this. Absolutely loving this. Okay, we're going to get started. I've asked Randy, if you would, to direct our thoughts, please.
So I pray. God, Father, we're thankful for this day where we are able to sit with your children and we are to love your word and listen to your word. Pray that this God you can deliver the message today on Obadiah and we might hear the message that was given and make applications of that in our lives today. Pray that we might be faithful to you and grow in our relationship and that you continue to renew our faith and be with us and use as an instrument in this area. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Okay, I'm putting this up here just to whet your appetite, so if at the end of class we have some time, I may ask if anybody's had any aha moments in their Bible reading. All right. Somewhere in the dark corner of your Bible, tucked away between Amos and Jonah, is this book called Obadiah. Statistically, the least read book in the Bible. There's actually numbers on it, all right? We could probably guess why. It's got a whopping 21 verses, all right? But there's a lot of unique things about the book of Obadiah. So what I wanted to do, if you were able to download the handout I sent out on Friday, I wanted to just take a moment and kind of apply some of the things that we've been covering, the observation, the interpretation, and the application. And then I posted some questions for you at the end of those, questions that hopefully would be relatively easy to answer after you studied. And what my aim is today is I don't want to rush through all three steps, but I'm hoping to spend a little bit of time on application. But before we do that, I need someone to volunteer to read 21 verses of Obadiah. All right, who's going to do this for us? All right, Jim, get it ready. Hang on just a second. Now, this has been one of the challenges, and maybe it was more for me, reading these things with fresh eyes, because for the most part, there's a lot of Bible knowledge here. We are well familiar with the minor prophets. We're well familiar with the messages and why God sent them. So I found it kind of difficult to read this and not think about pride, not think about anything else, and just try to kind of embrace, who is this Obadiah? Who's the audience here? Why is he saying the things he's saying? And when I tried to do that, it did seem to help me a little bit. But I just wanted to express to you that it can be difficult. So as Jim reads, listen and follow along to the best of your ability with fresh eyes. Jim, please.
The vision of Obadiah. Thus says the Lord God concerning Edom. We have heard a report from the Lord, and a messenger has been sent among the nations. Rise up, let us rise against her for battle. Behold, I will make you small among the nations. You shall be utterly despised. The pride of your heart has deceived you. You who live in the clefts of the rock, in your lofty dwelling, who say in your heart, who will bring me down to the ground? Though you soar aloft like the eagle, though your nest is set among the stars, from there I will bring you down, says the Lord. If thieves come to you, if plunderers come by night, how you have been destroyed? Would they not steal only enough for themselves? If grape gatherers come to you, would they not leave gleanings? How Esau has been pillaged, his treasures sought out. All your allies have driven you to your border. Those at peace with you have deceived you. They have prevailed against you. Those who eat your bread have set a trap beneath you. You have no understanding. Will I not on that day, declares the Lord, destroy the wise men out of Edom, and understanding out of Mount Esau? All your mighty men shall be dismayed, O Teman, so that every man from Mount Esau will be cut off by slaughter. Because of the violence done to your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever. On the day that you stood aloof, on the day that strangers carried off his wealth, and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were like one of them. But do not gloat over the day of your brother in the day of his misfortune. Do not rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their ruin. Do not boast in the day of distress. Do not enter the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Do not gloat over his disaster in the day of his calamity. Do not loot his wealth in the day of his calamity. Do not stand at the crossroads to cut off his fugitives. Do not hand over his survivors in the day of distress. For the day of the Lord is near upon all the nations. As you have done, it shall be done to you. Your deeds shall return on your own head. For as you have drunk on my holy mountain, so all the nations shall drink continually. They shall drink and swallow, and shall be as though they had never been. But in Mount Zion there shall be those who escape, and it shall be holy. And the house of Jacob shall possess their own possessions. The house of Jacob shall be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, and the house of Esau stubble. They shall burn them and consume them, and there shall be no survivor for the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken. Those of the Negev shall possess Mount Esau. Those of the Shephelah shall possess the land of the Philistines. They shall possess the land of Ephraim and the land of Samaria, and Benjamin shall possess Gilead. The exiles of this host of the people of Israel shall possess the land of the Canaanites as far as Zarephath. And the exiles of Jerusalem who are in Shepherah shall possess the cities of the Negev. Saviors shall go up to Mount Zion to rule Mount Esau, and the kingdom shall be the Lord's.
Thank you. No, I wanted to clarify something. I know David brought this up on Wednesday. I had planned on Obadiah on Tuesday. That was all coincidence. But I appreciate David bringing this up. All right. Let's talk about it. What do you see? Observations. What stood out for you? Remember, we're just, what did you notice? Maybe what drew some questions as you read Obadiah? Put that out to you. Yes, Amy.
Well, I'm kind of towards around verse 10 is where it seems like there's sort of a reason for what the I guess judgment that's being pronounced on Edom might be. And I just thought it was interesting that the violence that's done to your brother Jacob is because God's letting that happen. God is wanting that to happen. God is, kind of giving up the sons of Jacob to their own willfulness. And so it's sort of interesting that there's this other set of directions for that I find kind of applicable, the whole we don't need to have Schadenfreude, when somebody's behaved badly and they sort of get, some results of that seem consistent with our opinions about justice.
Yes.
That we don't need to feel like we're instructed specifically through Obadiah not to feel well, that's what they get, and instead look for opportunities to extend grace.
Right.
Good. That 12, I'm going to jump to this, but that 12 through 14, did you see the series of do nots? Yeah, those jump out. So hold that thought. Anything else? Any other observations? Jack?
It's a conversation of the Lord to Edom. Those are
Good. That's right. Conversation, Obadiah being the spokesperson. What else? Yes, Jane.
Also through 12 to 14, there's several, like, whether it's the day of his misfortune, the day of their destruction, the day of their distress. That's listed, like in those 3 verses, that's listed 7 times.
Yeah. Seven of those do nots. That's right. What else? Yes?
There's a contrast of 2 mountains going on here.
Right.
There's a Mount Esau and a Mount Zion going on. It's kind of that just popped out to me, this idea of these 2 mountains being really highlighted toward the end.
Good. All right. Ed?
Yeah, it's not the first time I observed it, but I think one of the fundamental things about it to observe is God is using one of his prophets to talk about a non-Jewish country, and he's judging them based upon standards that are consistent with what his standards are throughout Scripture, but especially loving your neighbor as yourself, and loving your brother.
Right.
And so there's something about that that's striking, because sometimes we think that the Bible is only concerned about how Christians are supposed to behave, and that's just clearly not what's going on here.
Right. The reading just kind of pops with some lessons. I mean, you just can't not read this and go, okay, I didn't get what the vision was. Any other observations? Anything else that just... Yes.
So, Ed mentioned it, but I think one of the reasons he's holding Esau or Edom to the standard is because of their kinship, their brothers.
Right.
Esau was the twin brother of Jacob, and even though that was a long time ago, he's saying, you need to recognize that Israel is your brother, and it's not appropriate for you to treat him like this.
I stepped back a little bit farther, and I'm just going to share with you how I worked through this. I tried to pretend that I hadn't read this before, all right? And I just took notes as I went. So when I read couple of verses, my first thought is, why is God doing this to Edom? Then my next question is, does Edom deserve this? That was okay. So I stopped there. I thought, well, if that's all I had, I'm really left hanging out in thrown out in midair here. But then as I read through, we started picking up on the questions. And when I looked there at verse 3 and 4, I asked, where do they live? They're up in the appears that they're somewhere. Being somebody who enjoys military history, my first thought was they had the high ground. All right, maybe they have the high ground here. Is there some significance? And then I was looking at that soaring like eagles, and I asked myself, what's the significance there? When I think of an eagle freely roaming, really doesn't have a lot of enemies. They just they're territorial, they hold to their area, and so maybe there's a connection there that Obadiah is trying to draw to them. And then he gets into some of this destruction and things like that. And then there's that latter part, the day of the Lord. That's always a good question. What is the day of the Lord? And where does near fit into this? Is it near, or is it near far away? These are questions that I had. Did anybody outline the book? Yes, Brent, what'd you come up with? How'd you break it down?
I said the first section is judgment upon Edom. The second will be Edom's day versus the Lord's day. The third will be God's people as agents. And fourth is Edom's destruction.
Great. I like that. Anybody else? Again, I find kind of outlining it might help me to identify some thoughts. Did anybody read, well, like I said, did you read this and say to yourself, there's a lot of history here? Yeah, when I read this again, I thought, wow, there's a lot being said here that I need to know a little bit more about. Who is this Edom and Esau and the mountains, and what is these roles here? And one of the questions I asked, and this is going to get into the interpretation portion of it, was this a one-time event for Edom? Did they just kind of fall off the wagon, this one event, or is there something going on with their history that might help me understand that? All right, any other observations jumped out at you? Any words? I didn't find any words there that I really... Yes, Brent.
Well, the other observation for me is that Jeremiah compares it to Sodom and Gomorrah as far as their destruction goes. And in the book, it talks about how Edom appears to be kind of in, shall we say, the eagle's nest and untouchable. And man would look at Edom and say, you're not going to mess with those people. You know, they've got the high ground, they've got control of whatever they want. And they were not a small group of people.
Right.
And what God is saying is that no matter how good it looked in Sodom and Gomorrah in man's eyes, or how good Edom might look, those are no challenge for me. And my sovereignty will reign, and no one will step over my line and go unpunished.
Right. Right. Yes, Carolyn, and then Norm.
When I first read it, I struggled with wanting to go to all the history of it. But when I forced myself to put that aside and just really look at what was here, I was able to clearly see so much more history about Edom just within this section by taking that away. Now, later on, of course, that gives a different layer of depth, but I feel like I was missing that because I was going too much to the history first.
Good point. Norm, and then back to...
The message that came to me was that Edom had the high ground, as you said, and they were proud. They knew they had an advantage, and they were proud. And God was going to take them down because they did not relate to those who were not with God, but should be, and they could be, and they were.
Good point. Yes, Ed?
The word that I looked up whenever I read it this time was pride. Because my experience has been that people read into pride some things that often are not supported by Scripture. And I discovered that this Hebrew word is the one that's used in Deuteronomy 18 to talk about a false prophet who speaks presumptuously. And I'm going to put an interesting twist on it. We get arrogant for lots of reasons. This is a form of arrogance that a person has where we presume to know how things are based on our own understanding, our own background, instead of actually waiting for God to make a decision or looking at how things unfold. And I think that's interesting that he then plays this picture of them way up in the mountains as they are and being an eagle and then taking them down. But all that has to do with their presumption. It wasn't that they had bad self-esteem, although that might come into play. It really had to do with the fact they presumed to know better than God how they were supposed to behave towards their brother. And that's not good.
Right. Good. Any others on the observation? You start digging into this and a lot of things start popping up. All right, let's get into the interpretation. And we worded the, Lord, help me understand it. All right. So let me throw a few things out there. Who is apparently our author? Obadiah. What do we know about Obadiah? Don't all speak at once.
We answered your question.
Do you know there's 13 Obadiahs in the Bible? All right. So, yes, Wes.
One of the things I read is there's actually two theories about when he lived. One of the Obadiahs you mentioned in the Bible is during the time of King Ahab.
Right.
And if it's that Obadiah, he's contemporary with Elijah, which would have been much, much, much earlier than when Jerusalem was destroyed. So this would be a prophecy of not only Edom's punishment, but of the destruction he's talking about towards Jerusalem. Or if this is happening, he's living at the same time the destruction happened, then he's more contemporary with Jeremiah. So
Right.
it's sort of a question of which one, like you said, there's others as well, but one of the theories is it's the guy earlier around the time of King Ahab.
Right, which gets into our date. We're going to talk about that here in a moment. What does Obadiah mean? I think there's something here. Anybody look up what Obadiah means? What does the name mean? Servant or worshiper of the Lord. Now, when I saw that, and then I read this, I felt that Obadiah is a very, very humble man. And he articulates very well. In 21 verses, I think his wording is just kind of profound. So I thought that was another thought that came to my mind. Here is a message on pride, which I hope to get into a little bit more detail on that. But who does God send? He sends Obadiah, his servant, a worshiper of God, descriptive of a humble man. I usually don't dive into dates, so I think they are important. But coming back to Wes's comment, there's two proposed dates. One is around the 840 BC, and one is around the 590 when Nebuchadnezzar attacked Jerusalem. It could be one of those two. It could be the days of Jehoram and the Philistines and the Arabians attacked the city in Chronicles. So there's a couple of things there. I did dive into some of my resources, and it was almost split. I had those in the 500 and those in the 800. I went, okay, I'm gonna leave that one. I'm not gonna die on that hill. So that was an important thing. What's the genre of this? What's the style of writing? Before I call on Ed. Yes, Ben? Poetry? Yes, I agree. I call it prophetic poetry. That's just it's Hebrew poetry, so it's prophetic poetry. Again, having to have an understanding of that would be helpful. We've kind of been talking about this, but how would you place the context of this? How would you describe the context of this? Because we've been talking about that a lot too. Before we get into application, the context, somebody give us a quick summary. Russ, did you?
I didn't raise my hand at all. It seems to me that the context is that the Edomites they've been evil people. And so, God says basically enough's enough. It's time that they pay up for what they've done. So because of their behavior, this is all going to take place now.
Well, I don't know if it's observation or interpretation, but it's kind of falls somewhere in that two categories. This is an age-old lesson. Cain asked a question, am I my brother's keeper? And that question was left open-ended, and God doesn't say, yes, you are, but repeatedly throughout the Old Testament and even the New Testament, the lesson comes home over and over again that, yes, you are your brother's keeper. You are. It's like one of the first lessons we see out of the Bible. You are your brother's keeper. Don't murder him. You are your brother's keeper. Don't add to his affliction.
Right.
And that's coming home again right here in this story.
Good. Ed.
In terms of genre, the other thing, I know it's backing up, but the other thing you notice, it's a vision. And visions are very singular. This is not necessarily then that Obadiah was told to go tell this to a particular king in Edom. This is a vision that he received that he then wrote up by inspiration of the Holy Spirit. So everybody in Edom or in Judah could read that. So part of the context of it being a vision is it's available for those of us who are not in Edom to go to school on this, as well as the people who might hear this in Edom.
Right. Because I was going to ask the next question, who's the audience? And I think you answered that. You've got Edom, you've got Jerusalem, you've got, we're following the divided kingdom here. Were a couple things that stood out. Another thing that I thought was interesting, Obadiah is not quoted in the New Testament. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, but it's not quoted. I just thought that was interesting because so much in the Old Testament, New Testament, we see that. Angie.
This is maybe context, maybe it's nothing at all, but I remember my mom teaching me. She always had these great little ways to remember things, and so she said, it's Obed Edom.
Yes.
And so I'm sure that maybe it didn't originate with her, but it's always neat when you I hadn't studied Obadiah until recently, but as soon as we say Obadiah, I think of that Obed Edom, so then anyway, that fits somewhere in this observation context situation.
It does. We got it. I love it. Yes.
Yeah. Thinking on verse 17, it seems like there's also a part we can observe here. There seems to be this remnant kind of thing that we know throughout the Old Testament. There are survivors. There are people who escape. There are people who find refuge. There are those who do turn to the Lord, even in this, if I'm reading that correctly. I'm trying to...
Right. Yes, there is. A couple things that again, you learn in your interpretation. What eventually happens to Edom as a nation? Basically, they what?
Disappear.
They disappear. Yeah, and there's something, yeah, they have, in other words, the prophecy that they're going to end does come to fruition. They eventually disappear as a nation. There's nothing left. Ed.
Yeah, just quickly, it's worth a nickel to study between the Testaments and see how this kind of took place over time. That different nations came in and took control of this general area. And you had these Nabateans who take control of that area. And then the Jews, under the Maccabean monarchy, went and conquered them and forced them to be circumcised and become Jewish. And so there's a funny way in which the history between the Testaments kind of fulfills this, but not, because really they don't live under the rule of God until Jesus comes along and makes it possible.
Right. So I made a list here. I didn't memorize these, but I'm going to read off a couple things, because remember I mentioned earlier, was this a one-time thing for Edom? Now we know in our Bible knowledge that they had a history there. We go back to Esau and Jacob and how it all started. But I went through and I just listed a few things to kind of get a big picture of Edom. So when Israel comes out of Egyptian bondage, or comes out of Egypt, and they want to pass through the land, what do the Edomites do? They don't let them come through. Numbers chapter 20. They don't let them pass. You're not passing through here. They oppose Saul over in 1 Samuel 14, 2 Samuel 8. In the days of King Jehoshaphat, Judah, Edom joined with Moab and Ammon to attack Judah. But the Lord intervened there on that situation. Edomites successfully rebelled against King Jehoram of Judah in 2 Kings 8. King Amaziah of Judah brought them back under subjection in 2 Kings 14. They again attacked Judah in the days of King Ahaz in 2 Chronicles 28. And so this just gives you a history. And then over in this is referring to Obadiah 1:10 and 1:18. They fought side by side with the Jews in the rebellion against Rome in 66 to 70. They were crushed by Rome, never to be heard of again. So there's a very quick history. Now, when you're reading this, it gets really detailed, but it was very helpful for me just to get this big picture. So now when I go back and I look at Obadiah and I look at those first couple verses, I'm like, all right, I see where the Lord's going with this. Not that a one-time thing wouldn't warrant God's justice and consequences for that. But we're talking about a history of a people here. Yes, Wes?
Tying into what Ed said, I think Edom became known later on as Idumea.
Say that again?
Idumea, the region of the Idumeans, and Herod was descended from those folks. So it's interesting what he was talking about, what happened between the Testaments. By the time we get to the New Testament, Herod the Great has built this, he's basically built onto Solomon's temple. And, and Herod was, about it, he's a terrible person. But there's at least a sense of keeping the peace with the Jews by helping promote the Jewish religion, right? So it's interesting kind of what's going on, the interplay between these peoples even into Jesus' time. I mean, like you said, as a nation, Edom doesn't really exist by that time, but they've sort of become this other people, and that's what Herod comes out of.
Right. I may have said this, I've got a lot of notes up here, but another thing that stood out for me, and I think somebody may have said this, is that you notice there's no mention of kings, there's no mention of the temple, there's not... Again, when I think of the minor prophets, I think of Judah, I think of the messengers, and this was a distinct message to this people. And as Ed pointed out, a vision for all of us to learn from. All right, just wanted a thought there in case I missed that. Ed, do you have a thought?
On the interpretation level, I appreciate and approve the positive stroke that you're doing in approaching this, because it's what we need to do. But when you see what it's saying, and you try to interpret what's there, it's important to notice how our neighbors who come to us and talk to us about Obadiah are often talking about this as something that has not been fulfilled. That God has to come back to Israel today. But once you understand that by the time of Herod, it had already been completed except for the rule of God which happens through Christ, then you realize none of that still is yet to be interpreted. it's important to get, that's part of interpretation, is to understand what it's not saying.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. That was one of the questions I have is when you're doing this, ask yourself, what is this not saying? Is a good one. All right, we got about 14 minutes. Let's talk about application. We've already been whetting our appetite with it, so let's get into this. Carolyn.
Well, I think it's important to think about rash decisions, for me anyways. That this is a history that starts with somebody selling their birthright for a fellow student, sorry. And this is kind of the culmination of that, where a whole history is built on. So just be careful about small decisions, big decisions, and pay attention to the things you're teaching your kids, how you're acting, what you're doing, because you don't know how big it will become someday.
Okay, good. I think there's a lot here. Yes?
I was thinking very much along the lines of Carolyn and how something that may seem relatively minor, if she used the word rash, but just kind of quickly in the moment you make this decision, but it can have a ripple effect through generations and really affect not just the course of your life, but many other people's lives. And I don't think any of us are dealing with birthrights and forage right now, but it made me think of things like adultery, like a one-time whatever, and it totally wrecks a family, potentially, wrecks a family, and has this ripple effect for generations.
It does. It does. I like that. What was that in porridge? Birthrights and porridge. I love it. Yes, Ed.
The big elephant in the room is that I've got to remember not to be presumptuous and proud. That when I'm arrogant, so that I don't love my brother as I love myself, and I do all these different things that flow out of that, God hates it. And God controls the universe, and that's not a good person to have opposed to me. And so I need to get my sense of who I am. Right. My perspective, sobriety, humility, all of those things.
Right. And so, Ben, I got you here in a second. So, like I said, the big picture is pride. But we got a few minutes. I really want to break that out. And Carolyn and Allison kind of got us going there and look at a little bit more details of that, because there's some very key things. We have time. I want to look at that verses 12 and 13 and 14 here in a moment and talk about the do nots.
Well, it may apply to that too. To us, we are God's kingdom, right? Just like this. And this is going to happen to us from outsiders. So the things we got to remember is God's going to take care of business, right? So it's okay to have this stuff happen to us. And if it's happening, we shouldn't gloat in our pride, like you're talking about in these middle verses. Right. Gloat over seeing these things happen when people do stuff to us. It's always God's kingdom, and we have to behave accordingly.
That's right. That's right. Mike, and then I saw Mike, then Jamie. I think Brent too. Mike, go ahead.
I really think verse 3 is a verse that we should almost memorize and keep in our hearts. The pride of your heart has deceived you. It's not anywhere outside, it's in us. The pride of our heart. O dwellers in the cliffs and rocks, whose habitation is the heights, who say in your heart, who can bring me down to the ground? Wow, when we trust and put our faith in ourselves, that's when, just as James, where does our sin come from? It's from our own hearts. Right. Man, we should really be thinking on that, dwelling on that, and being very careful of what's in our heart.
Right. Let me step back for a moment and let's just talk briefly about the possible location. Maybe perhaps this was Petra. And the reason why I had that came to my mind is my dear friend Scott Powell just got back and they went to Petra. He's been wanting to do this for years. He just got back from Israel. But one of the things I read about the path up there was so narrow 2 horses couldn't pass. All right. And so, again, just kind of thinking of some context here, that just getting this picture of being someplace where nobody can touch us. And then kind of make that connection to what you were saying, whatever that was, whether it was, self-reliance or a number of things we might discuss that we become reliant upon, where we start to feel like we're sitting in the cliffs. We've got the high ground, who can touch us? And we're like this eagle soaring. Jamie, and then back to Jamie, did you have a question? Yep.
Oh, so I was thinking back to the family of origin here, which would be Rebecca and Isaac, Jacob and Esau, and the dysfunction in that family, and how Rebecca favored Rebecca favored Jacob, and Isaac favored Esau, and how there was like division there, and they were playing, the kids, Rebecca played Jacob against Esau, and it just, to me, it's like, I think in families, there needs to be unity with the parents, first of all, together, and then the children. And I think we need to encourage our children. You support your siblings no matter what.
Yep. When we were studying this portion in our Sunday night class, the writer, Mark Hines, actually titled this section, Dealing with a Dysfunctional Family. Really, when he gets into all that. Brady.
I was just going to tag on real quick to the character of God and what we learn about the character of God in the book of Obadiah. And I think the two big pictures or the two big applications that I can make is God really cares about how we treat others is one thing. That's very important. And then the pride thing that's been talked about already is extremely important as well. God doesn't like people who are self-reliant. And that's really setting us up for an eternity through Jesus Christ, right? As we read these passages here, realizing that we're not called to be self-reliant at all. That was never part of the picture.
Right.
And there is going to be, as he says, he wraps it up really nicely, Obadiah does. In 17, he says, there will be a deliverance and there will be holiness. And so our job is not to find that in ourselves. We need to be in a position for that deliverance. We've got to be delivered from something, right?
Right.
And if you're self-reliant on yourself and your system of pride is all on what you're doing, what are you setting yourself up to be delivered from? Exactly.
Right. Good point. Brent, and then back to Jack.
One thing that's set up here is God's judgment, and it's addressing the point of loving your neighbor and not being an enemy of your neighbor, and loving your enemy as well, because Israel is getting the first punishment, and so God's punishment's going over all. And secondly, then Edom is sitting there laughing and carrying on and then plundering, blocking, pointing out every stray one that might be trying to get away, and just trying to create total destruction upon the Israelites. And God is warning us in this, I believe, that regardless of what you think your neighbor is doing wrong, you need to have mercy on your neighbor. You need to love your enemy. And if there's judgment, you need to leave that to God. And if anything, you would probably try to help or serve that person, not delight in their fault. Because you're going to die too.
Right. That was one of the things that stood out. Is the ultimate judgment belongs to God. Jack.
I was thinking in terms of security. Certainly there's a pride aspect, but they had focused on the wrong concern, in my opinion, because they're worried about the world. What's the best place in the world, this great high ground, or how do I defend myself against this, instead of what they should have been focused on, which is God, and all of us can fall into that. There's a house nearby us, and instead of beware of dog, it says beware of mice. So people might be like, oh, I could circumvent this dog or whatever. It's like, no, you need to worry about the owner. That's the person you need to worry about. And that little bit of focus, I think, can help to lead to all this other stuff that's been discussed. Right. Because why will I be good to my brother or consider this or not be prideful? It's because of God. If you don't have the fear of the Lord, it's hard to make an argument to do all that stuff.
Right, exactly. We got a couple of minutes. Let's go to verses 12 or 11 and 12. Just kind of point out some things that you've said, and I think Jack did a really good job of just kind of, putting this together. But just a couple of things, there in verse 11, on the day that you stood on the other side, the strangers carried off the forces. I mean, what did they do? All right, they did what? They stood by, and actually, hey, I got another one here. You want this one? All right. So that was one that kind of struck me. And the first thought that came to my mind is, am I willing to stand for God and his people? That was the first thing that jumped out at me. I'm like, okay, the takeaway from this, right? Not just my neighbor, but I brought this a little closer. And I says, am I going to be the individual that when I see there's distress, my brothers and sisters are being carried off, am I going to hide in a corner? Am I going to say I didn't see it? I don't know Jack, never saw Jack before. Or am I going to step up and say no? And that was one of the things that really I looked at, and it was kind of like that, really just hit me. Yes?
Might sound silly, but it made me think of Mr. Rogers said when bad, awful, sad things happen in the world all the time, and it would make him sad, and he would ask his mom about it, and she would say, well, when there's bad things, you need to look for the helpers. And there's always people helping and doing good. And I feel like this is the exact opposite of that. There was nobody making it worse, and there was nobody they could have helped.
Right. Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Look at verse 12. I want to look at one more thing. Do not gloat over the day of their misfortune. Do not rejoice in the day of their ruin, nor boast in their distress. The same theme there, but he uses a couple of words to describe this. And another thing is, it's the whole idea of rejoicing. I guess an example when, a criminal or something is put to death. Just this is an example, and we rejoice over that. That's heartbreaking. We can talk about justice and consequences at another time, but that's heartbreaking to see these things. And they saw it. Edom saw these things as it was just pretty much you got what you deserve. It's kind of that. I really, really despise the whole karma discussions that go around because I think they're just. I hope that we stay away from those. And it's that thinking, but really what it comes down to is you did this to me, therefore this is what you deserve. And I think several of you, Allison and Brady, all pointed to this fact of this ripple effect of carrying it with us as we go on. We carry this hatefulness towards an individual or a church, something that happened. And we carry this with us and we hear something that bad happened and we think, it's about time. No, so anyway, we're out of time. Thank you for discussion. I appreciate that. So much more in this obscure book. Thanks.